Water never seems all that powerful when it's flowing out of our taps or landing on us in the shower, but you'd sure change your mind after a tsunami or dam collapse. Water can easily cause chaos and bring entire cities to their knees. People even die when they're caught up in uncontrollable water. From dam failures to burst water mains, here are 20 times water went out of control. Water pipe explosion in Ukraine. One of the last things you expect to happen as you're walking down your local street is an underground water pipe explosion. But that's what residents in Kiev, Ukraine were subjected to in 2017. The ground began to tremble at random and an underground pipe dramatically burst. Once it did, sludge and debris were thrown at least 7 stories into the air with a combination of road debris, sand, and dirt. A woman was walking near the explosion site using her phone, but she was unharmed in the incident. Fortunately, no one suffered any injuries. The damage once the explosion stopped was incredible. Cars were covered in debris with their windows broken, and the windows of shops were blown out. The entire street was also covered in concrete, dust, sand, and general debris. At the time, no one knew what had caused the blast, but it was later discovered. Local officials were carrying out pressure tests in the pipes that used to bring water to nearby housing complexes. The pipes hadn't been used in nearly 4 decades and were holding cold water when the explosion happened. Wow, someone was going to be in a lot of trouble when they got back to the office. How do you explain that one to your boss? 2 dams fail in China. Dam failure is all too common in China, with aging infrastructure not always able to keep up with torrential rainfall. So this is what happens when water goes out of control in a failing dam. The water reaches record heights before the dam gets to the point where it can no longer hold it all in. At that point, it can all flow down into people's homes, businesses, and city infrastructure. In mid-2021, 2 dams in the northwestern region of Inner Mongolia collapsed after torrential rain during the summer flood season. They had a combined water storage capacity of 46 million cubic meters, and people living downstream were evacuated. Fortunately, authorities had the foresight to do this before the dams collapsed, which means there were no casualties, although nearly 17,000 people were displaced and tens of thousands of acres of land were submerged underwater. Plenty of transport infrastructure like bridges was also decimated. Over the weekend that the dam failure happened, an average of 87 millimeters of rain fell in Hulunbuir in a single weekend, and the Morindawa monitoring station recorded 223 millimeters. Footage of the dams had been posted online, and people were in utter shock. One of the dams had been completely swept away by the water. Unfortunately, severely lacking financial resources meant that almost a third of reservoirs for power generation and flood regulation had not had safety appraisals. Dam collapse in Brazil. 2019 was an awful year for the people of Brazil. January 25th marked the day that the tailings dam of the Brumadinho iron mine owned by Vale SA failed, leading to the deaths of 259 people, with nearly a dozen still missing a year later. Worst of all, that disaster happened just 3 years after another tailings dam ruptured, which was the most significant in Brazil's history. Both disasters involved Vale, since they owned and co-owned the mines involved. When the tailings dam collapsed, no one knew what had caused it, but experts had a strong suspicion that liquefaction was involved. This is when solid materials like sand lose their strength and start behaving more like a liquid. Studies and research into this event revealed a lot about what happened. Some of the most crucial points of research were that large-scale liquefaction had already happened across the fill before the dam collapsed. Once it did, huge forest and agricultural areas were devastated, and sediment in the Paraopeba River dramatically increased in the area. It was also noted that vertical subsidence was seen in the months before the dam's collapse, which is the movement of the Earth's surface caused by human activities and natural processes. Cauca River Dam floods. The year 2018 was not a great one for residents of Puerto Valdivia and Taraza in Colombia. In May, the government declared a public calamity as the Hidroituango Dam was on the brink of collapse. The dam was still in the construction phase on the Cauca River, but a sudden release of water from it flooded Puerto Valdivia and Taraza, causing around 600 people to be evacuated from their homes. In these small towns, dozens of homes, a health center, and a school were destroyed. Apparently, diversion tunnels had been blocked, with a possible cause being landslides in the area. As a result, the water was building up in the dam, and up to 130,000 people living along the Cauca River were at risk. Evacuation efforts were underway, with tens of thousands of people packing up and leaving everything behind in case their homes were washed away. Experts believe a renewed risk of landslides from mountainsides could block the water intake tunnels for turbine rooms and the spillway. This could compromise the entire hydroelectric project. The flooding situation wasn't just dire for those who lost their homes, but those the flooding actually cut off from civilization. Some rural communities were cut off from others for weeks and were experiencing food shortages. Morocco flash flood. Flash floods are common in Morocco, but that doesn't make them any less devastating for those who experience them. Nearly every time there's a flash flood, people die, infrastructure is destroyed, and people lose their homes. In 2014, flooding in southern Morocco caused the deaths of 32 people, with 6 others missing. A 9-year-old girl was also seen swept away by the Tamsort River's raging waters. At least 100 roads were destroyed, 6 of which were national highways, and about 100 mud brick homes were either a partial or total loss. Many of those who died in this flash flood were from families trapped in their vehicles and swept away. Another deadly flood hit northern Morocco in early 2021, with at least 28 people losing their lives. The flash flood hit the city of Tangier, where streets and buildings were inundated with water. An illegal textile factory operating in a house's basement had 40 workers trapped inside. At the time of the flood, the bodies of 28 workers had been found, with many of them dying from electrocution after power cables were submerged in water. It's unlikely that Morocco will ever see its flash floods come to an end. In the mountainous areas near the coast, heavy rainfall causes high surface runoff, which generates floods that reach high peak flow quickly. Tsunami. The epitome of water that goes out of control is a tsunami. Tsunamis are a series of waves in water caused by a huge displacement of water in a lake or ocean. They're typically caused by underwater explosions, volcanic eruptions, and earthquakes. Tsunami waves are nothing like normal undersea currents or even sea waves. Rather than being a breaking wave, they look like a quickly rising tide, which is why they're often called tidal waves. Every time there's a tsunami somewhere in the world, devastation follows. People die, lose their homes, and entire provinces are destroyed. Among the worst tsunamis to date was the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. Up to 230,000 people went missing or were killed in 14 different countries that bordered the Indian Ocean. Japan also has the longest recorded history of tsunamis, with at least 142 tidal waves classed as tsunamis. Nearly 131,000 people have died in tsunamis in this country alone. What may also not help the death toll is that you can't always precisely predict tsunamis, where they will hit, and how severe they will be. Drawbacks of water, and sometimes even a sucking sound, may indicate that one is on its way, and at this point, you should run to higher ground. However, after the 2004 tsunami, no drawback was reported. Fortunately, tsunami warning systems are becoming more popular in tsunami-prone areas, so people at least have a small window of opportunity to run for cover. Mississippi River flood. Many people living in Mississippi can't help but cry when they think about the events of April and May in 2011. At this time, the Mississippi River rose to the second highest level on record since 1937, cresting at 48 feet. After reaching historic levels, the river spilled out into parts of the Mid-South, destroying people's homes and businesses. At the time, U.S. President Barack Obama declared that Mississippi, Tennessee, and Kentucky were federal disaster areas, and 4,600 square miles of rural Louisiana were deliberately flooded to protect New Orleans and Baton Rouge. Across the 7 states experiencing heavy rain and storms, 348 people died and thousands of homes were evacuated. The flooding impacted Mississippi in a big way, the entire state in a state of limbo to see what would become of the heavy rainfall and flooding. Businesses on low-lying land were flooded with water as high as 6 feet, and access to and from Vicksburg from the north and south remained cut off for over 2 weeks. trucks. Major highways also remained closed for some time. Flood insurance is not normally part of a standard home insurance policy, which means many people were out of pocket if they didn't include this add-on. Surprisingly, flood insurance take-up rates remain low in Mississippi. Oroville Dam Failure. The Oroville Dam is an earthen embankment dam on the Feather River east of Oroville that forms an integral part of the California State Water Project. It's used to control flooding, store water, and create hydroelectric power. It's also the tallest dam in the US at 770 feet or 230 meters tall. As monumental and vital as this dam is, it almost didn't exist in early 2017. Heavy rainfall during the 2017 California floods caused damage to the primary and emergency spillways, which resulted in over 180,000 people being evacuated from their homes downstream of the Feather River. An entire fish hatchery was also relocated. The California Department of Water Resources needed to assess the damage and figure out what they were going to do next, so they stopped the spillway flow. However, the rain raised the lake levels, which caused it to flow over the emergency spillway, even once the damaged main spillway opened back up. This caused erosion that could put the concrete weir at threat of collapse, and if this happened, a 30-foot wall of water could have cascaded down the Feather River and flooded communities. Fortunately, this didn't happen, but the dam was further damaged. The main spillway was reconstructed the following year, and within 2 years of those floods, the state spent $1.1 billion on repairs to ensure it could operate as expected. Once-in-a-century flooding in Australia. Australia has plenty of natural disasters, but many of them relate to bushfires rather than flooding. However, that doesn't mean floods don't happen. In early 2021, Australia's southeast coast was hit by torrential rain that resulted in once-in-a-century flooding that caused thousands of people to be evacuated from their homes. Approximately 18,000 people were evacuated across New South Wales, and 38 regions were declared disaster zones. The flooding was so severe that the state premier, Gladys Berejiklian, said that she doesn't know of any time in a state history where they've had such extreme weather conditions so quickly and in the middle of a pandemic. And the situation was as dire as she described. Many rivers and dams around Sydney had overflowed, and many inland areas looked like they were in the middle of the sea. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison told Parliament that at least 700 flood rescues had been performed by emergency services, but that no lives had been lost. At least 8,800 calls had been made to emergency services. It's so strange to think that the region had been suffering from a drought that resulted in unprecedented bushfires just a year before this catastrophic flooding event. 2 dams fail in central Michigan. Flooding in central Michigan in 2020 when 2 dams failed was described as a 500-year flood. Both the Edenville Dam and Sanford Dam failed when the entire state of Michigan experienced heavy rainfall. Residents of Midland, Sanford, and Edenville all had to flee, and about 11,000 people were evacuated in less than 12 hours. Even though the flooding happened during the COVID-19 pandemic, traditional health and safety measures couldn't be followed. The Vice President of Disaster Operations and Logistics, Brad Kieserman, said it wasn't possible to avoid putting people in shelters with shared facilities, even though social distancing was recommended to stop the spread of the disease. The goal at this point was to make sure people displaced by flooding just had somewhere to go. At that time, the National Weather Service had also issued a flash flood warning for the Tittabawassee River in Midland County, with the river sitting 10 feet above flood levels. Fortunately, it had started to recede by that point. Governor Gretchen Whitmer said at a press conference that the flooding was unlike anything they had seen before. She said she felt like she'd said that a lot over the past several weeks, and that it was one historic event playing out in the midst of another historic event. Street filled with boiling water. There's never any guarantee that when you get inside the driver's seat of your car, you'll make it safely to your destination. There's always the risk of an accident. But what if you had more to worry about than a collision with another car? If you live in Russia, there's also the risk that you'll end up in a hot sinkhole and be boiled alive while trapped in your car. That's a nice thought, right? In late 2016, a huge pipe with hot water from a central heating system burst under a road, which opened up a massive 15-meter or almost 50-foot sinkhole. This sinkhole caused 2 cars to fall into it. Fortunately, no one was inside when that happened. The water was so hot that it was steaming, and anyone inside the car would have been boiled alive. The cars couldn't be pulled out until the boiling water was switched off, which doesn't exactly happen immediately. Unfortunately, this event wasn't the first of its kind, and when it happened again, people were inside the car. In Penza in late 2019, 2 men were boiled alive when their vehicle plunged into a vast sinkhole containing boiling water. The water was about 75 degrees Celsius or 167 degrees Fahrenheit and came from a burst pipe underneath a car park. Sayano Dam Disaster. 75 people lost their lives on August 17, 2009, when a turbine at a hydroelectric power station at the Sayano Dam in Russia failed. When the turbine failed, the turbine hall was flooded, causing over 6 people to lose their lives. A section of the turbine hall roof also collapsed, and all but 1 of the 10 turbines within it were damaged or completely destroyed. The hydroelectric power station supplied power to a significant part of the local area, leading to widespread power outages. So how does a turbine just fail? Well, turbines of the type used in that power plant had a very narrow window for working at high efficiency. If that window was exceeded, the turbines would vibrate with the water flow. These vibrations caused the turbines to degrade over time. Turbine 2, which failed first, had been a problematic one before this event. There had been problems with seals, bearings, and turbine shaft vibrations. It had undergone a complete reconditioning in 2009, which involved fixing massive cracks and defects. It was then undergoing scheduled repairs, which involved welding the blades. The turbine runner wasn't rebalanced properly after the repairs, and increased vibrations were expected. This caused further issues until eventually, on August 17th, there was a loud bang, and the turbine cover shot up and water began flowing into the machinery hall. Power output fell to 0, so the gates had to be shut manually to stop the flow of water, which took 25 minutes. Baldwin Hills Dam Collapse. The Baldwin Hills Dam collapse of 1963 taught us one crucial lesson. Maybe it's not a great idea to build a dam directly on top of an active fault line, even if some experts say it's not a huge issue. In 1963, the dam holding the Baldwin Hills Reservoir experienced a catastrophic failure that resulted in the flooding of several surrounding residential neighborhoods. 5 people died and 277 homes were destroyed. Fortunately, a greater loss of life was avoided due to fast rescue efforts. The failure all began with signs that the lining was failing. The dam then started leaking through the dam's east abutment. Within 3 hours, the dam had breached, resulting in 250 million US gallons being released from it into surrounding areas. The Los Angeles Department of Water and Power had built the Baldwin Hills Reservoir on a low hilltop in the 5 years between 1947 and 1951. It was on top of an active fault line, which was a subsidiary of the nearby Newport-Inglewood Fault. The underlying geologic strata was not considered stable enough for a reservoir, and its design meant there needed to be a compacted soil lining to stop seepage into the foundation. After its failure, the reservoir wasn't rebuilt at that location, and the area is now a community park. Vajont Dam Failure in Italy. The Vajont Dam is an 860-foot-high, double-curved, thin-arch dam on the Vajont River north of Venice in Italy. It is among the tallest in the world and sits 11 feet wide at the crest and 73 feet at the base. This dam is impressive in many ways, but it has also failed with catastrophic consequences. In early October 1963, a huge rock slide occurred with a mass of earth and debris estimated at 350 million cubic yards. This rock slide was the most disastrous in Europe and created earth tremors felt as far away as Vienna and Brussels. Waves of water reached heights of over 330 feet above the dam crest, and about 20,000 acre-feet of water went over the dam, which created flooding at the mouth of the Vajont River of approximately 230 feet. Warnings were not given fast enough for people to evacuate, and it happened at night when many residents downstream from the dam were in bed. As a rule, dam failures at night result in more fatalities than those occurring during the day. The fast-moving floodwaters resulted in the deaths of over 2,000 people, and many more thousands were injured. Most structures in and around the area were buried or completely destroyed. About 20 technical personnel in the control center monitoring the dam all died, and 40 people were killed in hotel buildings and an office near the dam's right abutment. This dam failure also resulted in 5 downstream towns being destroyed. Water break causes massive flooding in Houston. In February 2020, a water main broke in Houston, Texas, which caused water to flow for nearly 2 miles. Freeways, streets, and even cars were submerged in the water in East Texas, with some people having to sit on the roofs of their vehicles to protect themselves. As you can imagine, the flooding caused massive traffic disruptions, and State Highway 225 ended up being closed at Interstate 610. Mayor Sylvester Turner blamed aging infrastructure for the disaster. He said the 96-inch water main was 25 years old, and when it burst, private contractors had been working on it. This single main provides at least half the city with the water they need, which means many homes and businesses were then without water. A boil water notice was put in place for 24 hours, and food service businesses with no water pressure had to close. At the time, it was estimated that it would take up to 8 hours for them to fix the broken water main and about the same amount of time for the water to drain so that repairs could be made. Fortunately, it doesn't appear as if there were any injuries or loss of life. Banqiao Dam Failure. The Banqiao Dam Failure of 1975 resulted in the third deadliest flood in history, and it's an event that still plagues the minds of people in China today, all these years later. The Banqiao Dam Failure describes the collapse of not only the Banqiao Dam, but 61 other dams in Henan, China. The failures were a result of Typhoon Nina that hit the area in August of that year. When the dams collapsed, 10.14 million people in 30 cities and counties were affected, with the impact felt across 3 million acres or 12,000 square kilometers. The actual death toll is not known, but it's thought to be between 26,000 and 240,000. Up to 6.8 million houses were also destroyed. The dam failure occurred during the Cultural Revolution, and the Chinese government and Chinese Communist Party hid the details of the disaster until the 1990s. Details of the disaster were only revealed to the public for the first time when a book called The Great Floods in China's History, prefaced by the Minister of Water Resources of China at the time, was published. It's believed that when the dams were built, they were done so with the goal of being able to retain water rather than preventing flooding. In 2005, the Banqiao Dam Failure was rated number 1 out of 10 technological disasters in the world, outranking even the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Burst water main in Brazil. When a water main pipe burst for unknown reasons around 9 a.m. on August 1, 2013, residents in Rio de Janeiro were given a rude awakening. A massive torrent of water was blasted 65 feet up in the air over the Campo Grande area, resulting in the death of a 3-year-old girl and the injuries of over a dozen people. No one had any idea what was going on, but the force of the water destroyed both houses and cars. Up to 6 feet of water rapidly rushed into people's property, most of whom were still sleeping. According to the father of the 3-year-old girl who had died, the firefighters tried to revive her, but she didn't survive after ingesting large amounts of water. Brazilian media reported that she died of cardiac arrest. Another resident, Agilson Serpa de Silva, said he woke to an intense noise on the roof before the walls of his home were destroyed. The force of the out-of-control water caused him to be swept to the other side of the road. Even though the burst pipeline had been shut down, massive amounts of water were still leaking and continued to flood the neighborhood for a while afterward. Chanaral, Chile flood. Chanaral in Chile can't seem to catch a break. In 2015, 17 people were found dead and 20 were still missing when flash floods hit the Atacama region in northern Chile. The rains that fell were among the worst in 80 years, affecting what is generally one of the driest regions in the world. About 11,000 people were affected by the heavy rain, and approximately 4,500 needed to be placed in shelters. Whole towns were also left without drinking water. Chanaral was one of the worst places hit, with this desert town experiencing rivers of mud covering its streets. Many people lost everything. For some, it seemed like they had just gotten back on their feet before rains and flooding caused damage in the Atacama region again in early 2020. Chanaral was once again one of the worst towns affected, and mud and floodwaters swamped towns, settling in parts with a 1 meter or 3.2 foot depth. The area had been experiencing more rain than usual, and about 16 millimeters fell, whereas most other parts of the dry desert region get less than that in an entire year. Lagos flood. Lagos is a low-lying city on the Atlantic coast of Nigeria. In recent years, devastating floods have been hitting the area each year, resulting in costs of about $4 billion annually. Experts believe that rising sea levels caused by climate change could make this city uninhabitable by the end of this century. The flooding is then made even worse by the poorly maintained and inadequate drainage systems, combined with uncontrolled urban growth. It's an all-too-familiar sight for Lagos residents, seeing their homes and cars submerged in water and commuters wading through knee-high water on buses. Many residents believe the floods are getting worse each year, and 2021 was a prime example of how devastating they could be. People living in the Oka Oba, Akwa-Wanjo, Igbeta, and Ikoro areas of Lagos State experienced severe flooding that damaged dozens of vehicles and homes. The power supply was turned off, and a clogged canal contributed to the flooding. Residents were also warned to be careful when moving around due to electricity poles falling into the water with possible electrocution risks. People are getting tired of this situation every year. One woman even took to Twitter to say, "Every year, same in Lagos. Nothing is ever done about flooding but to tell citizens to move." Boscastle Flood. The Boscastle Flood of 2004 was one that residents won't be in a hurry to forget, even all these years later. The flash floods of Boscastle and Crackington Haven were caused by a horrendous amount of rainfall in just 8 hours, and residents believe it was one of the worst flooding events in their local memory. Some studies by the Environmental Agency also concluded that it was possibly one of the worst flooding events ever experienced in Britain, with the peak flow sitting at 140 cubic meters per second in a single hour. The flood was caused by residual heat from the Atlantic Ocean traveling to the southwest Cornish coast, making contact with the vertical coast and creating internal moisture in the atmosphere. This cools as storm clouds, resulting in heavy rainfall. About 7 inches of rain fell on high ground inland of Boscastle, and nearly an inch fell in just 15 minutes in Lesnuth, almost 3 miles from Boscastle. 5 caravans, 75 cars, 6 buildings, and many boats ended up washed into the sea, and 100 homes and businesses were destroyed. Estimated costs were at almost $20 million. Water going out of control is the last thing anyone wants to experience in their life. People die and lose their livelihoods and homes. Entire cities, regions, and countries are affected by flooding events. With climate change, aging infrastructure, and not enough money to cover upgrades in many countries, there's no saying how much worse the issue will get. Have you ever experienced an event like any of these? Do you think they'll get more frequent or less frequent? Also, check out our other cool stuff showing up on screen right now. See you next time!